Hey Sparkly Beans! Today I have a video that is particularly for folks who have wanted to connect with nature in some way, but it's really not your go-to mode. Maybe you're more of a mental kind of brain person, you like to be indoors, perhaps you're neurodivergent and you have sensitivities that make being outside hard for you. Maybe you live in a place where being outside is less accessible, or it's just not your go-to mode, but you feel like you should have some connection with nature because you're on a spiritual journey, you're a witch, what have you. If you're new here, hi, my name is Avery, and I help just-aligned, neurodivergent, and nerdy humans to cultivate ease and self-trust for growing into our emerging future. And I wanted to do this video because part of the framework that I often work with when I'm thinking about how to divorce ourselves from harmful systems as much as we can in this culture, how to align and reconnect to what is more natural to humans, to be more in connection, because I think that a lot of these harmful systems like capitalism, colonialism, racism are all about disconnection. And so, spiritual practice for me is all about coming back and reconnecting. And framework I like to use for this is I'll often talk about remembering in land, lineage, relationships, and self. So when I say remembering, I love that term as kind of a playful term, re-membering, because it's both obviously the connection to memory, to remembering, and literally like remembering that you haven't always been disconnected, whether that's in your lifetime or even beyond that, in like a more sort of spiritual sense of, your soul knows these things. But also the idea of being a member, of re-becoming a member, of repositioning yourself and placing yourself in these four things in your lineage, in your ancestry. Lineage in many different senses, not just blood ancestry. Remembering in self, so coming back home to yourself, back to self-trust. Remembering in relationship, so being able to be in community, being able to hold space for one another even when stuff is challenging, and kind of push off some of the harmful ways we've learned to interact with each other. And then the last one, which is what we're focusing on more today, is remembering in land. So, or you could say nature, land, sometimes I like move it around, but reconnecting to this sense of place being important, and the idea of belonging to place, and thinking of land not as private property, but as a living thing, as a living entity. I think a lot of folks, when they come to like a spiritual path, if they didn't already come from an animist tradition, will start to experience and connect to animism, to the understanding that there are spirits, that spirit lives in all sorts of things, whether that's plants, animals, rocks, the mountain, right? Getting to know all of these living entities is part of kind of grand matrix of what makes up spirit or connection or love or whatever you want to call it. So when you come to this, kind of worldview, and you're thinking about, okay, how do I reconnect to the land that I'm on? And there's a lot of different benefits to doing this. So, and benefits not just in the sense of for you, but benefits to everyone around you, to the land itself. So it's acknowledging this disconnection and reestablishing relationship with the land and with specific things on the land, whether that's trees, plants, animals, what have you. When you do this, it's both reestablishing relationship, it's fostering connection, but it's also reconnecting and developing trust in natural abundance, So a lot of the challenges that we have in this world, I think, come out of a false sense of scarcity. And that's not to say that people don't experience real challenges, and I don't think it's all mindset, but I think there's a lot of like this false idea of scarcity has created real material disparities in the world. But like our whole economy is built on made up things, right? It's built on lies, it's built on illusions. And while we typically do have to participate in the economy to be able to eat, I think that there's something really healing in understanding that that's not a natural state. That, it is actually like once you start to see some of the disconnection and the ways in which that mentality affects us, the idea that literally our sustaining life is requiring participation in harmful systems. I think I've found that I've developed more gentleness for myself in understanding both how fucked up things really are, and it's less scary to imagine, what if, the quote unquote apocalypse comes and we have to live off the land. You're like, that's a terrifying idea. Until you really get to know the land and realize actually like you could totally eat. There's medicine here, there's food here, right? So that's one thing as well. So there's reconnection, there's like connecting to abundance, and that's beyond just like literally imagining like what if I had to live off the land, but it's also like opening your eyes to be able to see more of the abundance that is around you, and how to connect to that. And then of course there's, if you are somebody who wants to practice magic, who wants to work with the elements, who wants to explore herbalism, all different like branches of magic that connecting directly with nature can serve as a classroom, a natural classroom, and can, of course, there's so many different ways you work with nature. But if you don't find this idea of nature and working with nature natural, maybe if you're someone who, like me, when, I started my own spiritual practice, and I even had this vague sense. I was like, if I were to be a witch, and I don't generally identify with that term, but if I were to be a witch, I was like, I would be a kitchen witch. I would be like, into like doing things in the kitchen and like working with plants. But like anytime I actually wanted to try to connect to or learn about plants, it felt very like and part of it for me is that I spent a lot of my life inside by choice, and that as a person who's autistic, like I have a lot of sensitivities and reasons why being outdoors for me is associated with pain, it's associated with discomfort, it's associated with sometimes feeling trapped, like kind of funnily enough, because you would think you would feel trapped in a closed space, not an open space, but thinking about times where I've done something quote unquote outdoorsy that wasn't right next to my home, and then feeling like how do I get back to my safe space? Haven't had a car in 20 plus years. So time in nature is often associated with like, like I'm not going to be able to escape. So for me, like being outside was actually a pretty big barrier to connecting with nature. Quote unquote simple practices that would be found in discussions of witchcraft or magic, I would be like, this is not simple, right? Like whether that's working with cultivating a plant yourself, whether that's foraging, whether that's just spending time like connecting with a tree friend, I would just be like, I was like, get in this, okay, we're gonna go outside, we're gonna do it, right? And so of course I didn't do it because it didn't work. It wasn't gonna happen. And it may not be that you're, anti-outdoors necessarily, but you may just be somebody who feels more natural sitting at a computer, sitting at a desk, being inside. And I think there's no real reason to shame yourself for that. I think it'd be very easy, and I think I did this some, I think it's very easy to judge yourself or shame yourself and say, oh, look, I'm just a product of capitalism, and here what the hell is wrong with my humanity that I'm more connected to a computer than I am to a tree, rah. And I just don't think that is very helpful. And I actually find it really frustrating when people in spiritual communities or witchcraft communities will it feels like there's a shaming tone or a tone of just go outside, it's easy. And an assumption that everyone who's into this stuff must be, really comfortable in nature. That's just not true for everyone, and that's okay. So I wanted to suggest some ways to kind of dip your toe into a connection with nature without necessarily actually going outside and without necessarily being in relationship directly with plants or with, touching anything. I don't mean to say that that's never something you'll want to do. And in fact, I have found that when I had the idea for this video, it was actually before this happened, but I did have a little bit of a breakthrough this year, or last year, it's 2023 now, a little bit of a breakthrough last year. And I was reading a book, really good book called Mirrors in the Earth by Asia Suler. And something about that book that hit me the right way, and I actually did end up starting a little bit of a connection practice with nature, actually going outside and connecting with plants. And I did find that very healing, and I do recommend it, right? I think it's when it's accessible to you, I think it is a good thing. And I found that these practices I'm about to share, years of these practices I'm about to share, got me to the point where I could venture outside, and where it was important enough and meaningful enough to me, and it just clicked enough, and it was the right time. And then I did that for about a week, and then I got COVID, and now I've been inside for 12 weeks. And now it's too cold, and my lungs will not be able to handle the cold, so I probably won't go outside for months. So even though I've theoretically pushed past the barrier and got to a point where I can connect with nature, I'm really glad that I had these other ways to do so, so that I don't feel weird and guilty and oh, I'm not visiting my plant friends. So that's another thing, is that this can be helpful, even if you do get to the place where it's more accessible, of having ways to connect that don't require you to be outdoors. So one of the ones that I think I've used the most in my own practice is natural metaphor and nature metaphors. Learning about the way things are in nature can teach us a lot about who we are as humans, about organizations, about relationships, about growth, about spiritual practice itself. And there's a lot of different places that you can go to kind of explore and learn about different concepts. I recommend the book Emergent Strategy by Adrienne Marie Brown is a good starting point. I recommend Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer, Undrowned by Alexis Pauline Gumbs, Liberated to the Bone by Susan Raffo. What other books have been? Oh, the Hidden Life of Trees by Peter, I believe it's Vollenbein? It's a German name. I'm blanking, but if you look up Hidden Life of Trees. And there's a ton of books coming out, this year in 2023, I've noticed. There's a ton of books coming out about this kind of thing, about the surprising and interesting and cool things about natural systems and what we can learn from non-human ways of life. You can also connect. If reading, full books is not really like your thing, you can also connect with decks. There's a lot of decks where like you can pull a card and then just look at the guidebook entry for that one thing. So lots of options to learn enough about how these things work that you can apply natural metaphor. But once you do, I found that like I'm often thinking to myself like, oh, that's so interesting, like this, concept that shows up in nature. So whether it's talking about like everything is a spiral, everything moves in a spiral, and reconceptualizing growth from linear to a spiral. That's one example I use a lot. Other natural metaphors. I mean, I'm always thinking about just like growth of plants. So it doesn't have to be that you learn a bunch of new nature facts, right? It can be very simple things and just thinking about how they apply. So like the basic concept of things grow and then they die and then they're composted and then things grow again, right? Is like a powerful thing. I found myself using in a database that I have. So this is a way that like I'm connecting like these nature concepts, even with something as like not nature-y as a database. I had a database of like ideas or projects, and I flipped the status field from things like, in progress, idea, whatever, to thinking about stages of growth. And it was like, is this idea a seed? Is it sprouting? Is it, what were the ones I had? It was like seed sprouting. There's one in the middle I can't remember, but like there's fruiting, harvest, compost. So it was like imagining where something is in the life cycle based on the stages of growth of a plant. So there's like little ways to kind of use things like that to reconnect ourselves to nature in that way. And there are a lot of spiritual teachers who use nature metaphors really well and can give you ideas for this. My tarot teacher, Lindsay Mack, definitely does it a fair bit in her work. Asia Suler, I mentioned the book Mirrors in the Earth, but Asia Suler definitely does this a lot. There's a ton of teachers who do. Another option is that you can certainly energetically connect with nature, with the land, with the planet, however you want to conceptualize it, without being outside. I don't think that there's certainly it is there are benefits to sitting on bare earth. I don't want to say there aren't. There are benefits to sitting under a tree. There are benefits to energetically co-regulating with nature. But if you're not able to do that, I still think that there, and this is part of like having a more spiritual or esoteric mindset, allows me to say, I think I can sit on my concrete ground and it's still the ground, right? And so I find that energetically I can still call in the spirits of the land, spirits of place. I can still call in, the land itself, the plants that are nearby, and still ask to work with them and to connect with them in whatever practice I might be doing. It's not a co-regulation, but I think it can still be an energetic connection. So that's something that I was doing for quite a while. I had practice of like sitting with the what is it called? The Pacific Northwest Tarot, because it is a deck that kind of corresponds to the land where I am right now, and working with that deck and kind of having a little conversation with the land itself before working with the deck, and then using the deck to communicate, to have a conversation with the land. And so that's something as well that you can do if you do want to energetically connect. I think cards are one, not the only one, but like one way of doing that. If there is a deck that is specific to your region, like there is for me, but even if there's not, just looking for a deck that has sort of earth-based or nature feeling, that feels, that resonates with you personally. And you can use that deck as a conversational aid in directly connecting and speaking with the land. You can also just use that deck as a learning tool. So I've definitely used Herb Crafter's Tarot is one good example that I've used a lot to learn about plants. You know, a lot of, I think, imagery of nature. Like, I need to spend a lot of time connecting with, getting excited about, like, developing an interest in and a joy around nature before I could actually interface directly because of all the sensitivities I have. So looking even at imagery of the plants and learning about them, there's so many good decks. You know, Herb Crafters is a really good one, although Herb Crafters Tarot is more about sort of relationship with plants and working with plants, and it has a lot of references to curanderismo, and it has some cultural specificity there, but also, you know, off the top of my head, there's so many. I mean, there's like really a lot. So you can kind of choose your aesthetic preferences and then the kind of deck that you're looking for. But I use the Earthcrafters the most. I have the Botanical Tarot. I haven't connected as much with that. I find the guidebook a little thin. Or just sometimes, yeah, I don't know. There's something about it, but I do intend, because it's got a lot of plants in it. It's a just bought deck. But a lot of plants in it, that it could be helpful. Animal decks, of course, and often, you know, it's like harder depending on where you live. You're not necessarily going to even be able to encounter all these different animals out in the wild. And so working with animal decks, the Brady Tarot is a great animal deck. Actually, I can look and see, like, so we'll have recommendations, because I do keep animals and plants on the same shelf. So, yeah, the Brady, what else do we have that's particularly, I mean, there are also, so I have decks that are plants, I have decks that are animals, I have decks that are kind of, actually would be good for, I think, this, like, natural metaphor connection or some more general themes. So, like, one, like, mass market deck that was actually the very first, fun fact, very first card reading that I ever received, first time I ever, like, encountered or connected with or even thought about, really, like, cards. And it was very shortly before, I mean, I was pretty old when this happened, right? This was 6 years ago. So I was already in my early 30s. For some reason, had just never encountered anything that I remember regarding tarot or oracle. But I happened to receive a reading at an event from somebody who was using the Earth Magic oracle, and so that's easy to find everywhere. Not necessarily like a specific recommendation, it's just like a random mass market deck, but that's one that, you know, has a bunch of nature-based keywords. And like some of these too, if you're drawn to a particular element or particular aspect of nature. So I mentioned, like, if there's a region, but also, like, if you're, for example, maybe you really connect to the ocean. You know, I have the Oceanum Arcanae. How does AE pronounce? It's the alumni, so it would be Arcanae, I guess. I have that deck. There's a bunch out recently that are ocean-based, Oracle and Tarot, so you can definitely find stuff. There are decks like, what's a good? Well, I mean, even the very popular Wild Unknown Tarot is animals. I think there are folks who would disagree, like, who would not necessarily consider that a good, like, plant and animal deck, but I don't know. I mean, one of the cards that was really, like, profound to me that I actually want to get one day, I don't know if I'll ever be able to afford it, but if I can, my whole freaking torso, I want to get a tattoo of a particular card in the Wild Unknown, of a modification of a particular card in the Wild Unknown, because of the Six of Cups in that deck. So it's like a pine tree, I think, on top, and I would get a live oak, a southern live oak for my roots, but it's a tree with rainbow roots, and I love that image so much, because as a queer person and thinking about, like, lineage and ancestry, like, I love the idea of getting a tattoo that's like a southern tree, so, like, place-based land, you know, where my, you know, with, of course, respect to the fact that my people are settlers and colonizers, but my lineage did live on that land for hundreds of years on all four sides, continuously, and so there's definitely a connection there with the South. So having this, like, I like the idea of having, like, the South and then queerness, and yeah. I mean, which brings up an important note about working with the land is that, of course, you know, we all have different relationships with the land. We all have different connections with the land, and trauma that is related to whether that's that our land was the land that our people are from was stolen from us, is currently occupied, whether it's that we were stolen from the land where we come from and enslaved and forced to migrate, whether we had to migrate because of, or people in our ancestral line had to migrate because of trauma on their land. There's all different reasons that people move from one land to another land, and all different reasons that people have different relationships with the land. You can even get into things like environmental racism and toxins and how even connecting with the land itself can be harmed by the fact that that the land is being damaged physically. So there's a lot of like possible things like that may come up when working with land, and I think it's likely that there can be some questions about like, who am I to work with this land? Is it okay for me to work with the land that I'm on because I know it's not my land? And then there's, of course, sometimes can be a tendency to want to like focus on the land where your ancestors came from. And especially I think in white folks, there can be this sense of like, okay, if I can like figure out where my ancestors from and focus on that land, then I will be more, pure or more ethical or more in integrity. And so like my witchcraft practice should be, only like Northern European, or should be, based here. And it's like a way of trying to, of course, like avoid harmful things, like avoid cultural appropriation, avoid that kind of thing. But, and that's important, and like, yes. And also, yes, and sometimes that gets weird, right? Sometimes it's like, okay, like you have, like, you might never have even been there, you might have no actual, like, no physical connection to that land. And it's not to say that you can't like honor the spirits of the land where your people came from, honor practices that are in your family line, but I think it is important also to acknowledge and work with the land where you currently live, because that's an act of devotion and gratitude to the land that is currently supporting you. It's, I think it's important to also incorporate gratitude and acknowledgement of the traditional stewards of that land, and to acknowledge if you are a settler on the land, if you are a colonizer on the land, to acknowledge like, yeah, this is unceded, stolen land, and like, it's not really okay that I'm here, but at the same time, I am a human being, and I'm allowed to be a human being. I'm allowed to exist, and we know that the realities of of life are not such that everybody can just get in a boat and go back to wherever, and that's a very like terrible idea too, right? So I think like connecting to the place where you are, with acknowledgement for your role and your people's role, and for thinking about things like land back, thinking about things like reparations, thinking about ways that you can give back and acknowledge harm committed, but at the same time also like come back to yourself as a fully deserving human, and that you are allowed to build relationships, because again, it's about this disconnection. I think the disconnection is a lot of what breeds some of this anxiety, or needing somebody to tell you you're allowed. Like what finding respectful ways to connect to the land that you're actually on, I think is really important. I also like, being someone who moved, moved a couple times in my life, but someone who lives very far from where they grew up. And so like I had a felt sense of relationship to some extent to the land where I lived, because I grew up there, and because when I was really little, and you may experience this too, right? That's the last time I can remember being in really like close connection. So my sensitivity really like pushed me away from this. And even when I was little, I remember being like, I don't want to garden because I might touch a worm, right? So I was like that about dirt. I didn't like dirt. But I did still climb trees, right? And so I had some relationship when I was little to like specific southern plants and that land. And then you know, it wasn't really until I like moved across the country that I'm kind of reconnecting and like acknowledging and thinking about that relationship and reminding myself of, oh, like I do have tree friends. Like they're there. They're, you know, tree friends from when I was little. Like that's part of the remembering in self. Like remembering that actually, like I did have I do have a connection to nature. It's just that I was pushed out of it. And for a long time, it felt, I was like this fear of this, like, I don't want to be unethical about, like, I don't want to say I have any claim to a land that I know my people directly colonized, like directly were involved in genocide. Although most of my ancestry didn't directly hold enslaved people, like a few people did, so that's there in my lineage, and you know everyone in my lineage, because they're all white, all benefited from enslavement of people, all benefited from genocide. And so that was something that I felt like, okay, I gotta really focus on that. And like there's no claim to Appalachia, like there's no claim, like this is not mine, like I need to only think about England, right? But you know, I think my understanding of that has changed, is that two things can be true. So that acknowledging the harm is really important, and the harm is very much present in there. And also, these were living human beings who did interact with and connect to the land in some ways, even as they were also harming the traditional stewards of that land. So it's a complicated story. It's always going to be. And so for me, like some of my practice, it doesn't actually include references to, you know, have decks that the Southern Botanic Oracle, when we're talking about nature, but also the Southern Gothic, those decks for me are really good for connecting with that relationship to the land where I come from, and then, you know, using the Pacific Northwest Tarot to connect to the land where I am. So incorporating both of those two things in there. And of course, that's something that even if you are a nature person, you're not necessarily going to be able to connect to the place where you're from, but you might want to do that. If you are somebody who is an immigrant, who, or even someone whose, you know, ancestors come from a different land, and it's important to you to connect to that as well, right? You can incorporate that into your practice, even though you can't touch in with it. Anyway, I got off on a tangent. So there are a few more decks. I would note Lisa McLaughlin, all the Lisa McLaughlin decks, the Plant Ally cards, the Tree Wisdom cards, I believe. There's a Permaculture deck, life design cards. Those are all really good and kind of non-specific regionally. Yeah, I think those are the main. I think I got a good little list. Oh, that's why I was like looking here, going where am I? Right, because right now I'm actually doing a lot of this work, and my table, my like tarot table where I actually read, is covered in decks like this that I can't see from here. So apologies. My list is incomplete. Maybe I'll do a little video of like nature-based tarot decks, and I'll link it above if I do. So that's you know, energetically connecting, working with cards, working with nature photography is another way to do that. You know, finding photos that feel connecting to you is a way to do that. Of course, you can connect with the quote-unquote products of nature. I think this is hard for me because on the one hand, I think it's like, I want to be non-dogmatic about, you know, I don't think that every herb you ever consume, you must have, you know, cultivated or foraged yourself and pulled from the earth, right? I'm not like that level of whatever about it. At the same time, you know, it is important to know that there are like supply chains involved in these things. So whether it's working with herbs, working with stones, working with like other, I don't know, like bones or wood or whatever kinds of, I say products is obviously not a term like I love for this, but materia, that's a magic term, right? So working with materia of nature, there's a lot of industry around this, and so there's going to be a lot of shitty practices, you know, especially with stones. I'm like often hesitant to buy just because it feels like I do not have the know-how to like be able to tell if there are ethical mining practices involved. And then like with herbs, I'm often just kind of like, I don't even know, like if I get it, whatever form I get it in, is it real? Is it, right? I'm not the person to go to for advice on this, but there are a lot of cool people online that you can go to for advice on like, where would you source things? And so, you know, if you do that, then that's another way to connect with nature within your home, is to work with things that come from nature. But it can even be as like, it doesn't even have to be that like fancy. That is clearly wood, right? This big old desk that you can't see because the phone's on it, right, is wood. So like there are things in this home that, sure, they were lumber and whatever, and you know, different people have different feelings about like, oh, like there's less like connection, or maybe it's harder to energetically connect the further something gets from its natural state. I don't know. I think that's very much, your mileage may vary, but like I could like sit here and touch the wood and like have a relationship to trees that way. You know? There are options around you. I think the last thing I'll say is kind of a bridge between like sitting literally in a basement with no windows and and connecting with nature and going outside. And that is, I know this is gonna sound silly, but you can look out the window. So, you know, if you have windows, if you have access to windows, literally observing the way things change outside your window, that was a big thing for me. I lived in an apartment that was above ground, and for the first year that I came out here, and it was in the Seattle area, and it was right next to like a nature preserve, and so just noticing, it was like the first time in my life I'd ever really noticed like, oh, this is like the time when the trees, like leaves start to fall off the trees. This is a time when, you know, and everything from like being able to actually see the moon, so I could see the moon cycles. Like there was such a healing. I cannot afford that apartment without a, you know, 9-to-5 job, unfortunately. But like it was such a healing year because, you know, being able to notice like the weather, notice because the weather, like we've been talking about like plants, animals, but also like the sky, the weather, the moon, the stars, like all these things are part of it as well. So like having a way to observe that, if you do, and to notice things like the cycles of plants, like what animals are around at what times, when the birds migrate, like all of these things you can totally do by just looking out the window. You can connect to the plants. You know, I've been doing this a lot with having COVID. It's like I can't go outside, but I can stand by the window and look at the plant friends that I've met that are real close and be like, hello, I promise I'm coming back. I know there's a wall between us right now and there's glass, but I love you. I like that. That works. And similarly, like if you drive, you know, you can certainly connect to nature through scenery, through like driving to places where you can encounter, you know, drive through the mountains, drive through wherever you are, drive along the beach. And even if you can't get out of your car, it's okay. So I think it's all about accessibility and finding practices that for you feel possible right now, and not necessarily seeing it as like a linear journey where, okay, this is like a step towards being able to go outside. But just like maybe that'll happen and maybe it doesn't. And when it happens, it'll probably be it'll feel fairly random, or be like, oh no, finally I can do this. But you know, there are a lot of ways to work with nature before you get to that point. So I hope this was helpful for you. If you have comments, you know, thoughts, questions, please drop them below in the comments. Love to hear from you. As a reminder, if this is helpful for you, this is a community supported effort, and so you can see Patreon links below if it's valuable to you, and you're of course able to give at any level. Of very much just encourage you to give at the value that you feel you're receiving, and that's up to you. I also have a newsletter, and that is really where you can find what I'm working on, what's coming up, new videos, new blog posts, all in one place. Make it easy, drop it in your inbox. So that link you'll find below as well. And you know, you can certainly work with me if you click down there and you take a look at the bookings that I have available. You know, I do have options for different kinds of readings and for mentorship. But you can also reach out to me because I'm happy to work with folks on building a spiritual practice, and particularly if you're neurodivergent or kind of neurodivergent adjacent, and this is something that you struggle with, of connecting, kind of being like a more systems brainy person, and how do I connect? I love to work with folks on this. So just, check that out below, drop me a line, get in touch, and let me know if there's anything that came up in this video that you'd like me to elaborate on in the future, or any questions you have. I would love to answer. Otherwise, good luck getting reconnecting with nature at whatever your pace is, which is correct and right for you. And that's allowed. Okay.